Thank you very much, Kimberly, and thank you very much to all of you who take the time today to watch this webinar and ask many questions. A very brief introduction to ORCID and the service provider program. Normally, this presentation is done by my colleague Shiv Naidu, so credits to him for the presentation. You're probably already familiar with ORCID as a community-driven organization because you're here. But in case you would like to know a little bit more, ORCID is an independent not-for-profit open to participation by all. The registry, as you know it, was launched in 2012, and ORCID is sustained by the fees of our member organizations. We're also guided by our values and funding principles and are governed by a board of community director that represents our membership. This means that if your organization is a member, you can both present candidates for the board and also vote for the board slate. By the way, this has been recently sent for everybody to vote in this year's slate. ORCID, as an organization, provides three infrastructure services. The first one is the ORCID ID that is very well known and adopted as a standard for person researcher identifier. The structure is the one that you see there, and it's free for researchers to register and use. Associated with that ORCID ID, you will see the ORCID record, which is some kind of digital CV or profile that include different metadata of the entire researcher career. This has employment, education, funding, peer review activities, research outputs, research resources, and other related metadata, always having in mind that those are non-sensitive personal data. And finally, the ORCID APIs that are a set of application programming interfaces that allows different systems to connect to the ORCID system and exchange metadata. This is also what we're seeing later today with the presentations. ORCID has been adopted globally, and in fact, we have at the moment over 10 million active researchers. Those are researchers that have actually used their ORCID ID in the last year, over 6,500 integrated systems, and over 1,400 organizations that are member organizations. Those member organizations come from 69 countries, and those include also 28 national consortia and 2 regional consortia. Think always of ORCID as a hub of research-related data that get propagated throughout the scholarly system. So with the researcher in the middle, always giving permissions to the different integrations, different systems can benefit of those connections and benefit, of course, of the reuse of metadata. So now let's cover what exactly is the ORCID certified service provider program, or in short, CSP program. It's a certification that is free for vendor and service providers, and those vendors and service providers can voluntarily apply for the certification. ORCID reviews the integration and checks that best practices are fulfilled, and then always recertified once a year. And this is very helpful for members because they can ensure faster and more reliable integration with ORCID, and for vendors because they can guarantee that best practices are fulfilled. Today, we're going to see one of the workflows that we've certified, which is the manuscript submission system. But we also have 4 other workflows that can get certified: research information systems, grant or facility, application management system, repository systems, and discovery systems. So if you are familiar with other organizations that provide systems that classify under one of these routes, we are happy to talk to them. And the idea, as mentioned, is to get a more consistent user experience and a better integration flow. With this, I thank you all very much for listening to this introduction, and I will hand over to the next presenter to explain more about Editorial Manager.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Donovan. I'm a Senior Account Coordinator with Aries Systems. And I'm joined today by Sonia Volsky, Peer Review Manager with the American Psychological Association. So I'll be talking today about the ORCID integration with Editorial Manager, and Sonia will be talking more about the client experience with the ORCID integration. So about Aries Systems, our mission is Aries transforms and revolutionizes the delivery of high-value content to the world. We are committed to providing flexible and innovative workflow solutions designed to help enhance the discovery and dissemination of human knowledge. We offer both editorial manager and production manager. Paired together, they can achieve a true end-to-end publishing workflow from content submission to peer review to publication and distribution. You can manage metadata, files, and other content, automate editorial and production workflow tasks, and streamline communications between all stakeholders. At the core of EM and PM lies 3 values to deliver lasting value and support the publishing process. These are customizable workflows, our expansive ecosystem of tools, and our reporting capabilities. EM and PM are built with flexible configuration settings that empower journals to uniquely customize their workflows at any time, often at no additional cost. We help build your workflow when first setting up an EM site, and you can then independently make changes as needed to accommodate your preferences and growth. Our ecosystem is designed to meet the industry's dynamic needs by connecting users with best-in-class tools and services, enabling publishers to seamlessly integrate new initiatives and fill workflow gaps without the additional investment of forming their own partnerships or building out their own network of tools. And for reporting capabilities, we have a robust reporting suite that provides publishers with visibility into important publication data for performance tracking and informed data-driven decision-making. We know that scholarly research is built on the foundation of interconnected data. Detailed information on the stakeholders, organizations, and submissions involved make scholarly metadata multifaceted and comprehensive. While systems like Editorial Manager capture and maintain this information, it doesn't end there. Many other platforms across the scholarly publishing lifecycle depend on accurate, well-structured metadata to operate effectively. So why is metadata important? When used at its full potential, it becomes a powerful tool. Maintaining standardized and accurate metadata allows for tighter control over your data and workflow, improving data quality and integrity. It also supports seamless interoperability between systems, ensuring data flows efficiently across different systems. Metadata can increase the discoverability, visibility, impact, and reach of a person or their research. It can also be used in detailed metrics reporting for greater insights into performance. It can also support research integrity and allow for easily detecting potentially important changes, such as an author list being changed between revisions, for example. As such, Aries strives to follow ORCID's enter once, reuse often philosophy for metadata and persistent identifiers. Recognizing the importance of metadata in scholarly publishing, Aries has championed the use of standardized persistent identifiers within Editorial Manager and Production Manager, and this is an important part of the Aries ecosystem. This allows for cleaner, more accurate metadata that can be captured and leveraged continuously downstream during the manuscript's publishing lifecycle. Through the Aries ecosystem of connected technologies, Aries has formed strategic partnerships with industry leaders in data standardization to integrate metadata solutions directly within our editorial and production tracking systems. Today, I will be focusing on our integration with ORCID to include the ORCID ID as a persistent identifier in publishing workflows. So our collaboration with ORCID formed in 2012. The integration at its core is to help link and verify ORCID records within Editorial Manager. This offers many workflow advantages. It allows users to use single sign-on. They can use their ORCID credentials to log into editorial manager sites. It supports author and reviewer identity verification, as well as reviewer recognition. So linking an ORCID with an EM account can be done in a few different ways, which I will go over today. New users can fetch and register their ORCID at registration. So they can enter their ORCID ID, click the fetch and register link, which will take them out to ORCID to log in, and that will authenticate their ORCID ID in the editorial manager site. Existing users can also register their ORCID with their editorial manager account at any time by going to the Update My Information page when logged into editorial manager. So there's a few different ways you can collect ORCIDs from users in an editorial manager site. One is at registration. So new users can speed up the EM registration process by choosing to use their ORCID record. At registration, they can click this Use My ORCID Record button on the pre-registration step, and this will open a login pop-up for the ORCID site. Users must log into ORCID and grant permission for ORCID to send information to the publication site. If the data are available and not set to private in the user's ORCID record, some fields will be populated automatically in their registration form on the publication's EM site. So you can see here, I clicked Use My ORCID record, signed into ORCID, and some information was populated for me on the personal information page, my name, my email address, and my authenticated ORCID ID. If a user forgets they have an existing account in an EM site, so maybe they submitted a manuscript a long time ago and forgot they already had an account in that site, if they go to register again, if they try to authenticate the same ORCID that is already linked to an existing account, they will not be able to proceed with creating the new account. Instead, EM will recognize the ORCID and will prompt them to log into their existing account instead. This is a great way to avoid duplicate accounts in a site and to ensure that a user's full submission or reviewer history in a site is maintained. So traditionally, users must manage unique login information across each EM journal. But with ORCID single sign-on, a publication can allow users the option to sign into Editorial Manager via the ORCID website, using their ORCID username and password or credentials instead of an EM username and password. This feature displays an ORCID icon on the publication's login page. So this saves users time and reduces the need to remember multiple credentials for every EM account. And this must be configured by journal. So if the journal allows for single sign-on with ORCID, this icon will display on their login page. Clicking the icon takes the user to the ORCID site to verify their credentials and confirm the ORCID identifier to use. Once verified, users are returned to EM and logged in. EM users who have already authenticated their ORCID identifier with their EM account can log in immediately using this icon going forward. Users who have not previously authenticated their ORCID identifier are asked to sign in or register normally. This process will authenticate their ORCID ID, and on future visits, they will be able to log in via ORCID directly. So enter once, reuse often. The user's ORCID password is never exposed to EM. The user is asked to sign into ORCID and authorize the login, and then the ORCID site provides EM with the ORCID identifier to use via a secure channel. So when a user begins the process to retrieve an authenticated ORCID identifier, EM sends a request to ORCID, which results in the presentation of an ORCID pop-up page. The ORCID page includes a statement, such as Editorial Manager has asked for the following access to your ORCID record, to let the user know the identity of the organization requesting the access. A publication can opt to have its own ORCID organization identity appear on this page, which enables users to easily identify the requesting organization. To discuss configuring this in an EM site, please contact your Aries account coordinator. ORCIDs can also be collected at author submission. So corresponding authors may be requested or required to provide an authenticated ORCID identifier as part of the manuscript submission process. This is configurable by journal, so this can be optional, required, or hidden. When this field is set as required, the author is not allowed to complete the submission process without first providing the authenticated ORCID ID. If the author has already authenticated the ORCID ID in the site, their request is not displayed at this step again, so they won't be prompted to enter it multiple times. So if the ORCID collection at submission is optional, when an author goes to approve their submission and submit it to the site, they'll be given the option again to update their information with the ORCID or to proceed without it. If the ORCID is required, they will instead be prompted to update their information with the authenticated ORCID before they can submit. To configure ORCID collection at submission, user editors with system administrator access in the site can go to Policy Manager and edit article types to configure the authenticated ORCID ID request. This can be set for new submission or revised submission and can be required, optional, or hidden. You can also ask co-authors to authenticate their ORCIDs at co-author verifications. So co-authors may also be so if a site is configured to request verification from co-authors, either at new submission or revised submission, the journal can also ask them to provide an authenticated ORCID identifier as part of that request. Authors can also be asked to complete a questionnaire at this step as well, if the journal would like. So ORCID collection for co-author verification would look like this. The co-author would click a link to verify their co-authorship and would be brought to this page in Editorial Manager where they can link their ORCID record. And to configure that, first you would want to create a letter template. And this can go out automatically at new submission or revised submission. And this will just let the co-author know they've been listed as a contributing author. And if they are affiliated, they can click this verify deep link, and that will bring them to this page here. And to ask for them for the ORCID ID, this can be configured in Policy Manager again by editing the article type. And you can choose for the ORCID authenticated ID request to be optional or hidden on this page. Another option for collecting ORCIDs from users in a site is a deep link can be added to any email generated by the system and sent to a specific EM user. So this would be email sent out from the Editorial Manager system. This deep link behaves like the fetch register link that we saw earlier on the registration page, delivering the user to the ORCID login register page if there is no authenticated ORCID ID for them in the EM system already. For users who already have an authenticated ORCID ID in the site, the merge code will instead display a confirmation message, letting the author know your ORCID ID is already linked and authenticated. And so that's for ORCID collection. Next, we'll talk about reviewer recognition and how the ORCID integration can support that. So for reviewer recognition, researchers volunteer millions of hours to conduct reviews, often without acknowledgement. Reviewers can consent to have their peer review activity in Editorial Manager deposited to their ORCID record. So a reviewer's ORCID profile can be updated automatically with information about reviews completed for a publication using Editorial Manager with the ORCID peer review deposit integration. These details are added to ORCID as peer review activity records. This is a visible, verifiable way to publicly credit reviewers for their contributions without compromising the confidentiality of the peer review process. It improves reviewer satisfaction and helps retain that talent for journals. So as part of this process, reviewers are asked to approve the transfer of their first review by responding yes to an authorization request configured to appear on the review form. As a convenience, reviewers can also have the option to define their response as the default response for future reviews that are configured for ORCID deposit. So if a user selects yes here, they can also check off that box to make this my default selection on applicable future reviews. This request triggers an authorization interaction with ORCID. Reviewers must log into ORCID and authorize the publication to update their ORCID record in order to deposit this in future reviews. ORCID also provides reviewers the option to give permission for one-time only authorization. If the reviewer authorizes the publication to update their ORCID record, the review details are added on the ORCID site as peer review activities for that user's profile. So this is an example of what that would look like. It would show the review activity for the publication and has some additional information like the type of review, the role of the reviewer, and the review date. So reviewers can also access the authorization request via an action link in their completed assignments folder when logged into Editorial Manager as a reviewer. Reviewers can confirm the current deposit status of their review, change their response to the authorization request as long as the review has not yet been transferred, or reauthorize an ORCID deposit if a transfer fails here. So the first step for configuring this integration in Editorial Manager would be to contact your Aries account coordinator to enable the ORCID API deposit functionality. A publication must have its own ORCID client credentials to use this feature in Editorial Manager. Once the integration has been enabled for a site, editors with system administrator permissions for the journal can make their own configurations to this integration in Policy Manager. First, you would want to configure the review form. And to do that, you would go to Policy Manager, Create, Edit Review Forms. Review forms are what reviewers are asked to fill in when submitting a recommendation for submission in Editorial Manager. This is where you can enable ORCID peer review deposit. Default wording for the authorization request and related instructions for ORCID review deposit are provided here, but a journal can edit the wording and make any necessary customizations to the instruction by editing instructions here. You also can set some additional parameters, such as the completion date detail to send to ORCID. So the options there would be year only, year and month, or year, month, and day. Also the ORCID review type. So there's a drop-down selected here to choose from different options. You can also the ORCID reviewer role to cite when the record is sent to ORCID. You can also set some thresholds. So if your site has editors give ratings to reviews, you can choose to only deposit reviews that have a certain rating or higher than that. You can also choose to only deposit reviews that were submitted on time or less than a certain number of days late. So those are all options for configuring ORCID peer review deposit. If desired, review deposit configurations can be specific to reviewer roles and article types in the site. For this, you would go to Policy Manager, match review forms to article types and reviewer roles. You can use the drop-down lists on this page in the grid to link different review forms to specific combinations of reviewer roles and article types configured in your site. And to configure the deposit parameters for ORCID peer review deposit, you can go to Policy Manager, Configure ORCID Review Deposit. This page allows the publication to define which reviews should be included in each batch of deposits with ORCID and to define the frequency of these deposits. So you can select a default response for new reviewers on this page. This controls the initial state of the question as displayed to reviewers on the review form. So if this is set to no, the review will not be deposited unless the reviewer changes their response to yes. If this is set to please select, by default, reviewers must select a response to this question, yes or no, before submitting a review. You can also select a revision review policy on this page. This policy determines whether a reviewer's ORCID record is credited every time the same submission is reviewed, or whether the ORCID record is credited only once per submission, no matter how many eligible review assignments are completed. And finally, you can set the frequency of batch deposits and select the parameter for when eligible reviews should be considered ready to deposit. Both of these together affect how quickly the reviewer is credited. Batch transfer can be done daily, weekly, monthly, or set every certain number of months. The publication may define the point a review is ready to be credited, and at one of those 3 points in the workflow, so when the review is completed, or when the author is notified of a decision, or when the final disposition for the submission is set. And so that's an overview of the different options we have with the ORCID integration and editorial manager. I'm now going to turn over the presentation to Sonia from American Psychological Association, and she will talk more about the client experience with this integration. So I will.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia Volsky. I'm a peer review manager for the journals program at the American Psychological Association. We are a publisher of scholarly books, journals, and videos in psychology, and I manage most aspects of peer review on our journals team, like guiding on policy and overseeing the peer review coordinators. Oops, skip the slide. All right. The peer review coordinators, or PRCs as we call them, are our experts in peer review policy and best practices. The PRCs work very closely with authors, reviewers, and editors daily, and they use EM, Editorial Manager, for virtually every task. So they're the first point of contact for the journal, the eyes and ears of the journal, so they have direct experience with the integration that we're talking about today. We leverage the ORCID integration in all of the ways that Christine described, actually. So here on the slide, you'll see we use it at a few points in our workflow. First, as a login option for users. Then at the submission stage, co-authors can verify their identities. And during the peer review process, reviewers can be credited for their work on the journal. Integration at each of these points has been a really clean solution for us for some of the issues that we would otherwise have to deal with regularly. So now to go into a bit more detail on how the integration has served us. As Christine mentioned, with users being able to log into EM with their ORCID ID, this eliminates the need for them to remember their login credentials for each journal. We publish 90 journals, which means we have 90 separate EM sites. So you can imagine how having a simplified, streamlined login option cuts down on user frustration and saves time all around. Also, as Christine mentioned before, having an ORCID ID associated with an account prevents new accounts from being opened in EM with that same identifier. So not only is it a quick login option, but it's also preventing duplicate accounts, which helps us to keep our records tidy. So this combined with the reliable identification aspect altogether saves users and our staff a considerable amount of time having to troubleshoot login problems or uncover duplicate accounts that we then have to clean up. We also encourage co-authors to verify their ORCID ID upon submission. This is currently optional, but lately we've seen a significant increase in the inclusion of ORCID IDs in submissions, which I think speaks volumes about the value that authors have been seeing in it. It's clear that people are finding it worthwhile to include. What we do is collect that information at submission, and then it remains part of the article's metadata. Then if that manuscript is accepted, the author's ORCID ID is published on the final article. So listing their ORCID ID ensures that the author's research activity can all be stored together. And it's also important for the scholarly record that that activity is logged and traceable. So it benefits readers as well who may want to look at the researcher's publication record in more detail. Finally, I want to speak a bit about ORCID's review deposit feature. We, as a publisher, have been expanding our reviewer engagement efforts with a focus on reviewer recognition. As I'm sure many of you know, the volume of manuscripts in academic publishing is growing right now, and it's becoming ever more difficult for journal editors to secure qualified peer reviewers. The integration with ORCID in EM gives reviewers an opportunity to claim credit for that work. So, as Christine mentioned before, being a reviewer is often a thankless role, and this is a way that reviewers can get the recognition that they deserve. And based on the uptake, it's clear to us that reviewers are using it, appreciating it, and invested in getting that credit. So You saw earlier how the opt-in process gives reviewers control and streamlines the experience for future reviews. And then for us on the admin side, it's a very simple setup, very low lift across the program. So it's very easy for everyone to implement and use, and that's really just a win-win overall. Something I didn't include on this slide is the enhancement to the editor's experience as well, since editors can easily access a potential reviewer's ORCID ID during the reviewer search if they need to, for extra assurance that this person exists and is validated by the system. And then my last slide, I've listed here some takeaways, and I encourage you guys who are reading this to consider the times we're in when you're thinking about the value that ORCID brings for us as a publisher. We're facing the same challenges that all publishers are reckoning with right now, which are issues increasingly related to misuses of AI, authors being impersonated, fake authorship, paper mill schemes, things of this nature that are a threat to research integrity. So as potential fraud increases, ORCID definitely offers a layer of protection against bad actors. It keeps a comprehensive record of scholarship and supports transparency in publication. It helps editors to identify researchers in their journal without adding additional barriers to submission for authors, which is essential. It ensures that reviewers are being recognized for their work in the journal. And finally, something I haven't mentioned yet, but want to say is that we all know that with any technology, any tool, users are very vocal when something doesn't work. And I just want to say we do not get negative feedback about ORCID. The integration is working well and it's being used with very few hiccups, and that is of great value to researchers and to publishing staff everywhere. So that is all from me. Thank you for having me here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sonia. And it's nice to hear you're not hearing any complaints from researchers, that the integration is working well. Firstly, want to thank both Sonia and Christine for joining us today for this excellent presentation, giving us a good idea about how Editorial Manager works. Unfortunately, I had some internet issues in the middle of the session, so I wasn't able to share a few links. So dropping a couple of very helpful links in the chat. There are some informational videos from Aries Systems about soliciting ORCID IDs, reviewer recognition, and ORCID single sign-on. So definitely take those links and save them for later. We have plenty of time for Q&A, so I'll give our audience a few moments to collect their thoughts and submit their questions via the Q&A. My first question, Christine, you mentioned that you've recently seen an uptick, an increase in co-authors providing their ORCID IDs upon submission. Can you talk a little bit about how co-authors provide their ORCID IDs in this process? And do you guys have any insight as to why recently there's been this increase?
So I think Sonia can talk about more about the
Sonia.
increase on API side. But the way co-authors can authenticate their ORCID is there's a configuration option in Editorial Manager, and this can be set by article type. So you can choose to do it for original articles and not for editorials, for example. So when you're configuring your article type, there is an option to ask authors to verify their contribution. So if the corresponding author adds them as a co-author on the submission at submission, either at new submission or at revision, you can configure a letter to go out automatically to those co-authors, asking them to verify their involvement. So when they click that yes, I'm affiliated link, the deep link in the email that can go out, they'll be taken to Editorial Manager. And once they're on that page, there will be a box where you can ask for their ORCID. So it will have that link where they can just click, authenticate my ORCID record. It will take them out to ORCID. They can log in, and that will add their ORCID ID to that author record. Additionally, there's an option to have co-authors register with the site at that time as well. So either they can just verify, and that will go to the author record that's on their submission, on the submission they're contributing to. But you can also have them log in and register. And in that case, an EM account will be created for them. and their ORCID ID will be authenticated for that account right off the bat. So if they're verifying co-authorship in the future in that site, their ORCID ID will already be authenticated. If they submit their own manuscript in the future or they review for a submission, their ORCID ID will already be entered. So it's a great way to just enter it once and have it available for the different types of activity a user can perform in an editorial manager site.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Sonia, you mentioned that there was a recent increase in co-authors adding that ORCID ID. Do you any insight as to why or what's changing?
I'm not sure what's driving it really. I don't have the hard numbers. It's kind of anecdotal, but we're really seeing a lot more ORCID IDs being included. And I think it's just kind of, propagating as a best practice. Readers are seeing it, seeing them in final articles, and they're finding them useful, I guess. So they want to contribute in that way too, to have that transparency in their articles as well.
Absolutely. And then something that you touched on at the end of your presentation, Sonia, was about, today's landscape and threats to research integrity. So I wonder if that could be another factor in, having as many trust markers on your ORCID record to prove that you are who you are and you are doing the work that you say you're doing is an impacting factor as well. And then talking about research integrity, obviously editorial manager and the publishers that work with you all, are working to add trust markers to ORCID records. So I'm curious, Christine, could you share just a little bit? What does Aries see as its role in supporting research integrity and transparency across the scholarly ecosystem?
Sure. So EM and PM allows for maintaining standardized and accurate metadata across both the editorial and production workflow. So improving the data quality and research integrity. And part of how we do this is with integrations and having those standard persistent identifiers to allow for easy interoperability between the different systems. So with ORCID peer review deposit, for example, EM can facilitate adding peer review activity records for a user to a user's ORCID profile, which can increase the discoverability, visibility, and impact of that person in their research. And also, as Sonia mentioned, it's a great way to verify the identity of reviewers and authors. So the editorial staff can also refer to that as well. And also it's an easy way to collect that identifier at the start of a workflow. So right at registration or at author submission. And when that ORCID is authenticated and it's added to the people record early, it can go all downstream through the entire workflow. So an ORCID that's authenticated by a corresponding author at new submission can later be transmitted to the production system in the XML once a manuscript is submitted, for example. So that can go all the way from the first submission to transmitting to production and publication.
That's great. That's great. And then, Christine, could you talk a little bit, and this may have been mentioned in the presentation, but in case it was, just coming back to it, can you talk about how editorial manager ensures data accuracy and avoids duplicate ORCID IDs when syncing with the ORCID registry?
Yeah, so the system will recognize if an ORCID is already authenticated and associated with an existing account in the editorial manager site. So it is a great way to avoid duplicate records because sometimes an author will submit something years ago and they'll forget that they already have an EM account, especially since, traditionally they're managing unique accounts across a lot of different editorial manager sites. So they might not, and they might be from a different institution email. For example, they've changed institutions and that's changed with their account. So when they go to register or log in and they put that ORCID in, if it's already associated with an existing account in the site, editorial manager will have a little message telling them this ORCID is already associated with this account. It will tell them the name and the email address that that record is associated with. And then they can, if it's already authenticated, they can just single sign on, log in. So it's not like they're even bounced back and have to reset the password. They can log in to editorial manager, update their email address if that needs to be done, update any, information that's now out of date. So that's a great way, and it reduces a lot of frustration for people who might not remember their past registration details from a long time ago. And it's a great way to prevent duplicate registrations, which helps maintain the complete history of a user in an editorial manager site. So all the reviews they've submitted in the past, manuscripts they submitted in the past, that will all stay with one record in the site.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing. I think we can relate to some of those struggles when it comes to researchers associating one institution email with their record and then moving on from that institution and no longer having access to that. So always good to have a different primary email or secondary email address. Christine, I think this question is for you, more on the specifics of editorial manager. Can you display orchids on the Find Reviewer search results page?
I would have to double check, but
No problem.
I can check that after this and then let you know.
I can jump in quickly. I was actually looking into that preparation for this, and it doesn't show up on the search results, but you can click on the user's name and it'll pop open their little profile and you can see the orchid there.
Good to know. Well, thank you. And then Sonia, as Christine was talking about all the different authors, you mentioned you have 90 different journals. So I can only imagine how many different authors you have for each journal. So I was just wondering, can you share what has worked as, can you share how that's worked in practice, like managing 90 different journals with editorial manager and that orchid integration, and what benefits you've seen in your workflows or community engagement? And do you have any advice that you would give to anyone on the call who's looking to implement this kind of workflow?
Sure, yeah. So the last thing we want to do is add a barrier to an author who just wants to submit their paper, get it under consideration. We don't want them to sit there for hours trying to get this manuscript into the system. And that all starts with the login process. So if they can log in quickly with their orchid and avoid, having to reset their password or emailing the editorial office, like I can't get into my account, that's just a big time saver on the author's part as well as our staff. So that's just a great benefit there. In terms of advice, I think going for the orchid integration, you just kind of have to adopt it and set the default and then inform your users that you're using it rather than having a drawn out deliberation of like, should we do this, should we not? I think it's just a no-brainer to add personally.
Wonderful. And then could you talk a little bit, what kind of resources or how many team members do you have dedicated to work on, anything relating to editorial manager and orchid? Do you have a large team? Is it a small team?
For these, we have 11 peer review coordinators on our team and one operations specialist as well. For the setup, a lot of the coordination of that was handled by our operations specialist. But then for each journal, each coordinator has a portfolio of journals that they're the experts on. So they kind of own that journal across the board. They're the main contact for that journal. So any troubleshooting that would happen would go directly to them, to that coordinator. So it's been a few years now since we implemented the orchid integration. So I would have to go back to them and check on if they have an estimate on how much work it's cut down on in terms of like login issues or correspondence back and forth. But yeah, I think it has streamlined their processes a lot.
Excellent. It's always nice to hear. My next question is a little bit more about what's happening behind the scenes. And Paloma, maybe you can also, after Christine and Sonia give their input, you could share a little bit from the orchid side. But could you all expand like what's happening behind the scenes? What makes this two-way exchange between editorial manager and orchid secure, efficient, and valuable?
Sure. So I can start. EM interacts, or editorial manager interacts with the orchid system via the orchid API. So it uses various orchid API calls for example, to request the ORCID ID of the user currently interacting with the editorial manager site, to request permission to read information from the user's ORCID profile. So like I showed you during the registration process, a user can authorize permission for EM to pull in some user details from the user's ORCID record. It speeds up the registration process. Also to request permission to update the user's ORCID profile with reviewer activities. So that's the ORCID review deposit integration. And users authorize these interactions with EM and ORCID, so it's done with their permission. I mentioned this during when I was talking about registration, but the user's ORCID password is never exposed to Editorial Manager. The user is asked to sign in to ORCID and authorize the login. And then the ORCID site provides Editorial Manager with the identifier to use via a secure channel. So once a user has authenticated their ORCID in Editorial Manager or in multiple Editorial Manager sites, it's a quick, secure way to log in quickly with those ORCID credentials that are associated with their people record.
Paloma, is there anything you want to add from the ORCID side about what's going on? Or Sonia, did you have more to add?
No, I was just going to add, like, after you set up your ORCID integrations with the customization that you want, there are no manual tasks as far as I know. It's very automated. So it's really nice on the admin side.
Yeah, I'm going to just to complement, because basically the authorization parts that was shown already is actually how it works. Then on ORCID end, every single researcher will have a part in their profile that is called trust parties, and they are going to be able to see there to which integration, or to which journal, to which association they've granted permissions. So then they can also see exactly which permissions they granted. And if at some point they don't want that connection to exist anymore, doesn't have to be the case, but could be the case, they can revoke permissions there. And as long as they don't revoke permissions, those permissions will be given to the journal in question or the association in question. And that works very well, because it's also a way to keep ORCID and researchers in particular in control of their data.
Great, thanks for the additional context, Paloma. I think we have time for another question or two. So another one did come through the Q&A. Let me know, Christine, if we need some more context so we can request that. But the question is, do you have any issues with the API link between Editorial Manager and ORCID?
I've never experienced an issue. Yeah, I did a lot of registering and logging in with single sign-on before this presentation, just to familiarize myself with the process. But I'm an account coordinator, so I receive support requests from clients using Editorial Manager, and it's a pretty rare support request to, like an issue with ORCID login. With anything, like I'm sure, errors occur and you might have to retry the request. And we do have options for that. So if like a transfer fails when you're using ORCID peer review deposit, we have an action link where the reviewer can go in and authorize it again. Yeah, as Sonia said, it's pretty seamless. It's a great integration between the two systems.
Anyways, if I may add, if at some point a problem happens in the integration, or either editorial manager clients are experiencing an issue, we normally help also with every single request that comes. And as Christine was mentioning, so far or in the past months, we haven't gotten any, but it could always be the case. So this is why we have member support activities also to cover any potential question and escalate those problems that might actually be related to the infrastructure.
Absolutely. And I think the submitter has added a little bit more context. They said sometimes we find that the fetch link doesn't resolve if the user has logged in via a magic link.
Sorry, what was the kind of link?
So they find that the fetch link doesn't resolve if the user has logged in via a magic link?
It's not something I've heard of personally, but I can certainly look into it more on our side.
Sure. And if this attendee would like to reach out directly, feel free to just send a note in the chat and we can connect you and see what's going on there. I do think we have time for one last question, and I'll open this up to both of you, perhaps starting with Christine, just from your perspective. In your experience with APA and other organizations that are utilizing Editorial Manager with the organ integration, what are the biggest factors that influence successful organ adoption within journals using Editorial Manager?
I think just presenting it often at different workflow steps. So we have a lot of configuration options available for Editorial Manager journals. So you can have, that option to log in, or when you're registering, you can give users the option to use their ORCID record to complete their registration details, or just to authenticate it during registration. It can be presented to corresponding authors at submission, to co-authors at verification. You can also, I mentioned that deep link that we have available. So when sending correspondence from Editorial Manager, you can have that deep link, which will ask users who don't already have an authenticated organ in the site to do that. And that has an easy link they can click and it will bring them right out to that page to verify their organ. And if they already have one, it will let them know you're all set. That's authenticated, so you don't have to worry about the deep link confusing users who already have one registered. So I think that's key, is just giving users in the site options at different workflow steps, and not just depending on them to go in to update my information and finding that step themselves to authenticate that organ.
Great, thank you. Sonia, anything to add from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I agree. Having it, presented as part of the publishing landscape for sure, just as a standard practice, I think is a good idea. And also giving examples of the concrete outcomes that come from using it. So how does it show up on your ORCID profile? How does it show up on your published article? Just kind of things that show that this is an established thing in publishing and that there are real benefits to using it.
Great. Well, thank you both. Want to take the time now to say thank you again to Christine and Sonia for joining us today, to give us a great presentation about Editorial Manager. And it's so helpful to see it here from the client perspective as well, to give a really well-rounded idea of how Editorial Manager works with ORCID. I'm going to share a link in the chat if anybody's available tomorrow and would like to join us for our last webinar of 2026. 2025, not 2026. Our last webinar, we'll be meeting with Simon Porter, and he's going to be talking about the ORCID public data file and how you can use it in Google BigQuery and all the fun things associated with that. So come join me, Paloma, and Simon to learn more about the ORCID public data file. Once again, thanks to Christine and Sonia for joining us and for today's wonderful presentation. And Paloma, thanks for giving us an overview of the CSP program.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.